Well, let's start by talking about the decision and the motivation to capture and tell your life story at this point in time.
Well, there was several motivations. I'm old, and I've had a lot of stories and situations which I think are worthy of other people knowing. But initially, I was started off by a good friend of mine, and ours, should I say, my wife and myself, who was the book editor of the New York Times. And we'd get together for dinners and I tell him stories about the big artists I work with, all the small artists, and the various situations that I got into. And he would always say, "Well, these are really interesting stories. You should really write a book." And I said, his name is Jack, and I said, "Jack, I'm not a writer. I'm in the music business." He said, "Look, all you have to do is apply yourself, put 2 or 3 hours a day in, and just start." And it was his cajoling that kind of made me start, writing these what became giant steps. And that was pre-COVID, and I wrote about 60 or 70 pages. But it was hard for me, to be honest with you. It was I didn't have the sort of dedication of applying myself, to be honest. I see the phone light up and I think, well, I better take that call. So I over a period of 3, 4, 5 months, I did about 60, 70 pages. And then COVID hit. And I got COVID right at the beginning. I mean, I was one of I guess I dodged a bullet because I was lucky that it didn't go into my chest or anything like that. But I was isolated for literally 6 weeks or 7 weeks in my bedroom. My wife would leave a tray of food outside my door. It was almost like I was in isolation, literally. And all I had was the TV and the laptop. And that's when I said, okay, I was supposed to watching Cuomo on TV. Let me see what else I can do to, spend my time. And that's when I picked up the story and I wrote another 100 plus pages during that period. And then I put it down, and then I got involved in other things, the catalog stuff. And then, about 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, a friend of my son's heard that I was in the process of writing, and he told me that he knows a guy that can help me finish off what I was doing, and his name is John Wiederhorn. And John and I got together, and he was the perfect guy to kind of transcribe what I wanted to put out there, and basically he was the last sort of the the last guy, I guess, uh, person to say, okay, let's finish it off and make it a book, which, again, I never intended to be an author, and it's still bizarre for me to be called an author, but he helped me finish off and put things in order. And ultimately, I've got a book which is now out, and apparently it's quite good. So I've been told. I don't know.
Now, you said the initial draft was more than 500 pages. Talk about the process of pouring your thoughts out and then whittling them down into the narrative.
Yeah, initially they were, and they were probably even more. But I, I together with the publishers and John said, look, I mean, 500 or 600 pages is going to be way too long to engage uh, the reader. But at the same time, I did want to make sure that it wasn't just um, a book about the usual rock and roll disaster, the car crash, books that I've got literally on my shelf here. I wanted to make sure the book said a little more than just me and music. I wanted to make sure that the book told a story about me and um, my family, me and the values, and why the values were important in my life story, if you like. So, it's not, it isn't, I've spoken to a couple of people and they've mentioned that it's not the usual kind of, rock and roll, sex, drugs, and rock and roll rehab and this, that, and the other, and salaciousness. No, that's not what I wanted, and that's not been my life. It's been, in fact, quite opposite to that.
Yeah, you said you're not a writer, but actually you are a writer. You've written wonderful music, incredibly complex concept records. How would you compare the act of writing for a book to writing Gentlegiant records?
Um, well, actually, yes, I was a lyric, I'm a lyric writer of a band and also music as well. Um, uh, an incredible application that you have to dedicate yourself to a long period of time and keep focused. And to be honest with you, one thing that, if you like, Gentle Giant had is what we were kind of an ADHD band. We didn't focus too well on keeping things and doing 50, 48 bars of different kinds of things. We chopped things up, and I think that was part of our makeup and part of my makeup. So um, it was pretty hard to sort of continue to focus, but I did apply myself with John, and so I guess I am an author because it turned out the way I think just about the way I wanted it to be. I didn't want it again. I didn't want to tell silly stories about drugs, sex, and God knows what else. Even though some of the 500 pages were whittled down because I had some of that in there. Then I thought, you know what, this is not really what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about was, again, what I just said to you with the values and the art and the music, which is the most important thing, not about the silly stories that other, autobiographies for me silly that they seem to be. It's not about, the rehabs and all the babes you've screwed and God knows what else. Yeah, that's not what I wanted to have it in print, basically.
So the book is a very interesting construct. It feels mainly like a two-act play with your music industry experiences almost serving as an intriguing mirror to your life as a musician. What's your perspective on the dramatic arc that the book reflects?
Well, the arc and I hope the theme of the whole book is about music and music, good music. I mean, and when I say good music, and music which is authentic, whether it be, my first group, you know, or my or Gentle Giant, of course, or the bands that I've been involved in and or signed. Uh, what I wanted to make sure of was that, um, and even me in my life, that I didn't I didn't live a life that would follow. I didn't want to say I want to be like this guy or be like this guy. I followed my own instincts, and I followed and I to good for good and for worse, if you like. Um, I did things my way. I mean, the song my way. But the bands that I was involved in on the arc, from being a musician to overseeing other people's lives as musicians, were that just about everyone, every band, in their own way, were also authentic. And when I think back very recently, because I've been talking about this book. Just about every band I signed and have been involved in still have a career after, 15, 20, 30, 40 years. And I'm proud of that because, because even bands like, and I'm going to say a band like Bon Jovi, I mean, he's as big as ever. And whether people like or don't like him or his music, um, he had an authenticity, believe it or not. And so did Pantera, and so did Dream Theater. They had authentic, they were leaders in their field. And that was very important to me.
Now, when you were writing this book, were you intentionally trying to create contrasts and allegories between the two universes you occupied, or did those contrasts just sort of naturally emerge when you were writing it?
They actually emerged. In fact, they still are emerging. I just mentioned a story, that these bands that I have been involved in, I signed, um, for the most part, are have a career. And the only way you have a career, a real career, and you keep your success going is when you're authentic, when you're the leader in a field and not chasing someone else who's big or trying to sound like someone else. And that's very important. That's very important. That was very important to me as a musician. And and the band Gentlegiant, we did things that we wanted to do. It was probably selfish and dumb, but nevertheless, it was something that was very, very important to the band. And the fact that we were able to play and make a living at it was even better. But it kind of blossomed that whole idea of, as you said, the thought about that kind of it was almost, again, it was something that came as a natural sort of situation. It was a natural evolvement. I didn't think about it to make it sound like it was. It was what it was. It came from there. It came from my heart. And that's where everything should come from. The head, heart, gut, and soul.
That could have been a book title.
Is it? Well, there you go. The follow-up.
Um,
Please don't.
well, I'd like to explore some of the contrasts in the book that people will enjoy when they read it. And you mentioned that the name Simon Dupree gave you a role to play, and that was important to your success as a frontman. Talk about that role that you occupied in the band and how that related to the roles you saw other musicians playing during your days in high-profile A&R.
Well, Simon Dupree was a name given to the band. I mean, I was with my two other brothers, and other musicians, but I was a singer and the guy that was in front, and I, um, you know, to my brothers Ray and Phil who were in the band, it was a little odd, but nevertheless, I was the pretty face supposedly, even though this ugly mug tells you different. Um, and it was just funny sometimes that Ray and Phil were asked back in those days, what's it like to have a famous brother as a, what's it like to have a famous brother as your, as your singer? And they were just like, what? But I was always, I guess, kind of driven in certain respects, even as a boy. I mean, at school, I tell the story. And it's absolutely true story that I went to, grammar school in England. At the grammar school, I got a scholarship to an all boys, very strict grammar school. And in those days in England, you were streamed. You were streamed. It was a horrible class system situation where 3 or 4% of the kids at 11 years old were streamed to be the next leaders, the elite of the UK. And most of the boys that I went to school with were being streamed to be the next politicians, the next doctors, the next professors, teachers, etc. And I remember that story, that's in the book actually, when the careers master at 14 came around and started asking, where are you going to specialize in? And the kids next to me would say, I'm going to be a physicist, I'm going to be a physician, I'm going to be a politician. And I literally said, I'm going to be a rock star. And everyone laughed. And the careers master said, don't be silly, Shulman. That will never happen. Well, I was determined even then. Um, it wasn't a joke. I mean, and literally 3 years later, or not even that, 2.5 years later, 3 years, I had my first record deal and I was just finishing school and came back to school and signed the careers teacher's autograph. So, being a front man and having a vision of myself, I knew even then that that's what I wanted to do.
Well, contrast that, and you do this in the book, with finding someone like John Bon Jovi, you pretty much would say the exact same thing at the beginning. And was that something, were you sort of looking for a reflection of your own instincts and the people you were working with or seeking out?
When he said what he said to me, when I sat down with him, and he was this very pretty kid from New Jersey who came into my office, and all the girls' heads turned around when he walked in. And he had the song Runaway, and I was, speaking to him about what kind of band he's putting together. And I said, what is it you want to be? Because, I didn't know whether he wanted to be a pop star or a rock star. Um, I think you know the story, but I'll tell it anyway. Um, that I said, well, who is it and what is it you want to be? Because, that's important to me and it's important to you. And he looked at me, and in the same way that I said to my careers master what I said, he looked at me and said, I'm going to be as big as Elvis. And, you can see when someone is either joking with you or trying to have you on or really, really meaning it. And it came from every pore of his body that he absolutely thought and wanted and needed to be as big as Elvis. And, literally about 2.5 years later, when we put Slippery When Wet out, um, I don't know if he's big as Elvis, but certainly he's John and the band is certainly up there in their popularity.
Well, continuing with the theme of contrasts in the book and also John Bon Jovi, in the book, you describe how Simon Dupree had to perform for Parlophone to get a record deal. And during your days of Polygram, of course, you had Bon Jovi do the same thing for that label. Was there a sense of deja vu or vicarious experience in that situation for you?
Um, Now I come to think of it, well, no, yes and no. For Simon Dupree, it was a bizarre situation because we went up to Abbey Road, and we thought, okay, we're gonna play two or three songs for a couple of producers, and who knows what will happen. And literally the whole staff, maybe 23 or 24 staff members came down and seated themselves in front of the stage which they had there, including George Martin, including David Paramore, including Alan Parsons, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they said, well, play. And we said, well, play what? And they said, play your set. What? Okay. So we literally did a 2 hour set in front of 20 or 25 staffers of the EMI. And in those days, by the way, EMI had a kind of a hierarchy. So the producers and engineers wore regular clothes, but the tape ops and like people other Jeff Emmerich, for instance, would wear wear these cloaks like engineers, like religion. They didn't wear like regular clothes. Anyway, we did that, and uh, we went home. We saw, did we? God knows if we got a deal or not. About 3 or 4 days later, our manager came over to our house and said, "You're on Parlophone Records." So that was, an incredible sort of message with John Bon Jovi, I guess, in certain respects, because he was putting the band together. We did do a couple of showcases. Um, and there's a difference because when we did our showcase, this is Simon Dupree, we were really good. We played and played and played and played. We literally played 12 gigs a week all over Europe. And we knew how to perform and we knew how to present ourselves. The band, John, when Bon Jovi, did their showcase, a couple of showcases for me and then for the team, they weren't quite as good as they should have been. Nevertheless, I said, I could tell John and this new guitarist, Richie, who's just joined, is going to be a thing. And I said, to the head of the department, they're going to be big. I want to sign them. And he said, well, it's your gig. You go ahead. And I took him under, I took him under my wing. Um, and he literally, we were joined at the hip to a certain degree. And I actually went to his house, and his mom and dad said, if you're going to sign John, please look after him, which I did until in New Jersey, and then I went on to different things.
Yeah, in the book, you chronicle the sibling rivalry you experienced in both Simon Dupree and Gentlegiant in great depth. And then you ended up working, of course, with the Bon Jovi brothers and with the Dorashuk brothers in Men Without Hats at Polygram, both of which had ridiculously dramatic issues. Contrast how your own experiences enabled you to deal with those bands as an A&R person.
Um, well, the Dorshak brothers, I mean, that was really Ivan was the kid was the guy. Ivan was the leader, and there was no doubt about that. It wasn't a thing. And and John, I mean, John had two other brothers, but he was the band. I mean, so there was no sibling situation there. The only I'm trying to think other sibling situations. And I don't think I had any other bands that I had to deal with. Uh, in the case of Gentle Giant, of course, it was a whole different thing. Having three siblings, and with Phil and myself. Yes, there was how can I put there was not rivalry per se, but there was um it's hard to describe. We were like Phil was the oldest, older. He was 10 years older than any of us, and being older and that old, he felt he should be the leader. He should be the guy making decisions. At the same time, I was the front guy, and so it was almost like the young lion scratching to take the pride over rather than rivalry. So we get to go each other. But even then, Phil, um, as a kid, I mean, we had that as well. But at the same time, it was a crazy kind of relationship we had because he was a mentor as well as a rival. So it was I mean, with brothers and siblings, you don't know how they work and how they pan out. With Ray, we were best friends. We were literally best friends as well as you know co-conspirators in the band, even from day one, from the very first time I put the first group together in Simon Dupree. We were as one. And Phil came in, and it was a little supercharged, and the band was always were worried that we were going to break up because Phil and myself would go at it, but there was never any violence. It was just I guess it was just the elder lion trying to keep hold of the pride, and me saying, no, you're wrong. I'm the guy that it should be the guy making decisions.
In the book, you do talk about the Bon Jovi brothers and having to extricate um, his brother from the situation in terms of
Oh, oh,
management.
oh, that was his cousin, the second
His
cousin.
cousin, I'm sorry, his cousin, right, not the brother. Okay.
Yes, no, it's absolutely. Yes, the second cousin, absolutely. Because in fact, John had signed when he signed the deal, he didn't mention that he had signed a deal with Tony Bon Jovi, who owned the power station. And when Tony heard that he'd signed the deal with Polygram with us, he basically started a lawsuit. And yeah, that was ugly. And there was a lot of bad blood um that went on between his cousins and himself. And we had to get my business affairs guy to extricate John out of that contract, which is an ugly contract, to be honest with you. However, that being said, had it not been for Toady, the song Runaway wouldn't have happened because he did produce that, not with the band Bon Jovi, but with session players, and that's what got him signed initially. So there's right and wrong on both sides, but his deal was to have 2 or 3 points for the rest of his life, whatever happened, and John, it just wasn't fair to John, and it wasn't fair to the band, and so. But even up until today, he still has a couple of points on the first couple of records.
On a quick side note, you discuss your contributions to Men Without Hats, Pop Goes the World in some detail. I've always been curious what happened with the follow-up, The Adventures of Women and Men Without Hate in the 21st Century, um, which obviously did not perform. Had you left Polygram at that point, or what happened with that record?
I'd left Polygram by then. Yeah, Men Without Hats was kind of like my last hurrah, if you like, with the Dan Reed Network and Kingdom Come and then I'd left Polygram and had joined I joined the Warner Group as head of ATCO. But Pop Goes the World was the album that I worked with Ivan, yeah, I was really proud of that because initially when he gave me I loved Men Without Hats. I loved a Safety Dance. I thought it was quirky. I thought it was really interesting, and I think and for what it's worth, um, Gentlegiant were really popular in the French Canada, and especially really good music, and they came from Montreal. And For whatever reason, I heard this song, and it was a very big hit. And when I heard that they weren't dropped because their record label fell apart, they had some new demos. I wanted to hear them, but they didn't send them to me, and Ivan sent them to me, and really they weren't very good, except for one little thing at the end, which had this little sound. And I called him. I said, Ivan, I think your band. I loved Safety Dance. I loved what the band looks like and stands for. But I'll tell you what. If you come to New York, I'll tell you how I think you should approach your album. And in fact, he did. And I said, the songs you put on this album is not who you are, but that last little piece of music, make that into a song which will grab listeners and kind of be the follow-up to what you've had. And here's what you do. Um, and the rest of the songs trash and and write stuff that is more interesting. Had it been me, I mean, had it been Gentle Giant, I would have said to my A&R guy, go to hell. But he said, but the fact that I think I know, in fact, he told me that he was a fan of Gentle Giants, and he knew that I was a musician, and I wasn't talking because I was this guy in a suit saying this is. I actually told him the kind of stuff that he should be doing. He came back with some more music, and it was really good. And this little thing at the end turned out to be Pop Goes the World. So we went over to England, we recorded the album, and there was a couple of other things that we did together. In fact, there was a song called On Tuesday, which was a follow-up. And he said, well, I wish we could have some kind of flute or clarinet or something like that. I said, I'll tell you what, let me call Ian Anderson. And Ian came over and played the flute on Tuesday, and we put out Pop Goes the World, and they had their huge follow-up.
I'm sure you heard the other record that was made for Polygram after you left. What did you make of it?
I didn't like it. It was not very good. It's strange and it's sad, but I just I didn't think it was a very good record. Um, you know, it's funny because it was for me doing this kind of thing, even as I was running labels, working with bands was really important. I love musicians. I am, I was a musician. I am a musician. And just allowing the band to just do what they think is right, and you could give them advice. is the best thing you could do. So it wasn't a good follow-up, and obviously it didn't work. Um, but there's, now I think about me in at Polygram with working with Cinderella, for instance. There was a song called Nobody's Fool. I don't know if you know that song. Like, but I wrote the song with Tom. He wrote this verse, which was a really good verse, and then it went on to some long-winded thing that didn't make any sense. I said, Tom, that verse is great, but where's the B section? Where's the chorus? And because it's such a great feel, and I said, how about this? And I picked up a guitar, and I said, try this chord, try this chord. Um, and we came up with nobody's. To be honest with you, I borrowed the licks from Def Leppard's "Bringing on the Heartbreak." I stole the idea. Not really, but it influenced me, and it became a very big hit for them. But that's one thing I could do is not just say, "Why don't you?" Because I think that I could actually pick up a guitar and or any an instrument and say, try this chord." And that's something that on the executive side of the fence, um, I didn't just say, try something different. I'd say, why don't you try something like this and be able to show them what I meant?
So now Gentle Giant bucked all prevailing trends of what rock music could be, and then similarly bucked the stereotypes of what an A&R man could be, avoiding the sort of gold-chained hookers and blow caricatures, as you mentioned in the book. So again, did your mindset as an uncompromising artist influence your mindset as a record executive?
Yeah, absolutely. I had absolutely no aspirations to be an executive. I mean, that wasn't even on the radar as far as I'm concerned when I was in Gentle Giant. However, when we stopped, um, there wasn't a plan A, B, or C. And so when I got the call, um, my initial thought, my answer was no. I don't want to be part of this. However, I said, the guy that called me, Dan Young in Polygram, said, look, come to New York and at least, hear what we've got to say, because I think you'd enjoy it. And it's called the Rock Department. There's no sort of corporate stuff that's going on. And I did go to New York and I met with the head of the department and he offered me a job. And I thought, well, what else do I have going on? I was offered to do production and to be in, start other bands. I didn't want to do that. I'd been there and done that. And I was married with a kid. And I I decided to take the job. And it wasn't A&R initially. It was basically promotion and artist development. Um, and I remember the first day I went there and I got this little tiny office that, not even in the corner. It was like so, it was like a little closet. And I went from office to office to office and literally realized that every office had their own agenda. Every office had their own priority. Every office were pulling for what they wanted. And I realized, having come out of Gentle Giant, that, we never had anyone champion the band. And I realized it was about the record companies championing this one band. And, I realized that, okay, this is how it's done. Um, and at the end of the day, that first day I said to my wife, I don't think I can do this. This is really not my world. She said, like, just hold on. You'll learn. You'll be okay. And I decided to stay and listen. What the one thing I was able to do was not open my arm, open my mouth, and just listen to other people talking. And I realized for the most part, I'm going to say this, but and most of the people there were kind of idiots. I shouldn't say this, but not really idiots, but really were didn't understand what it was like to be in a band and what you needed to how you needed to speak to a band and how you had to um, uh, be a part of that band. And that's one thing I did uh, on the executive side was um, when I signed a band, I was part of that band. I really was. I was a member of the band, and that's how I got the trust, being able to, tell stories about how not stories, but how I approach things. And with bands like something like AC/DC, for instance, we're talking about Siblings again. They allowed me in because they knew that I was a musician. And I got the thumbs up from George Young, actually, of all people, because he knew that my group, Simon Dupree, he was in the Easy Beats, and he said to George and they said to Malcolm and Angus, if it's the same Derek Shulman that was in Simon Dupree, let him in, because they were very, very close shop as far as record company people were concerned. They would let anyone in. So that's how I was able to um, you know, be be in the band. I mean, part of the and get their trust and 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 have them not just listen because I don't, I listen to them and then say, okay, I think that we could do this based on the knowledge I have with a record company.
Yeah, you were just talking about the positive influence of your wife on your career and life, and you spend a lot of time in the book discussing marital fidelity. And you also talk about your sowing of your wild oats as a young man with Simon Dupree. And I'm curious of getting that out of your system so young, did that enable you to be a much more devoted husband during your A&R years?
Yes, I think it did because as as I said, as you know, I mean, I was on the road literally when I was at school. I mean, my brother Ray, I think he was 15 when we were traveling everywhere in Europe when we even as semi-pro, and then we went professional when we had the first record deal. So I was what 16 or not even 17 when we were traveling everywhere, and and yeah, I mean, when you're 17 and you're full of testosterone, if you like, um, the opportunities arrive, and but certainly for the most part, um, we weren't we weren't a Motley Crue kind of band. Even Simon Dupree, we take our music, we even took that music very seriously. We took our work very seriously. We were workaholics, but certainly when those situations arose, um, I can't say I was an angel, but I wasn't sleazy either. And sometimes, when you slept with a girl when in the first go around and before I was married, and you slake off and the girl would say, "Oh, will I see you again?" You wouldn't see her again. And I kind of felt, this is not really me. This is really I'm not that person. And even in those days, it was kind of felt I'm not sleazy. I'm not that kind of sleazy person. And I think, that we were all this. This is, even Simon Dupree, but certainly Gentle Giant. We were dedicated to our partners. And now I think back, in our own way, it's interesting to note that every one of us, literally, have the same partners we had back in the day. None of us have had multi-divorces and God knows what. We've all been married 40 plus 50 odd years. We've all, committed to someone who we loved and which is which says a lot about the people that the band was about. And that dedication to your partner, that was the same dedication we had to our music. It's interesting. I just, I put two and two together and realized that that was something that is very different to most other bands. I don't know what to say, but
No,
yeah.
that's great. Well, I'm curious, how would the Derek Shulman of the Polygram A&R era have advised the Gentle Giant of the mid 70s?
Um, continue. For first of all, I would not say uh, do something that is more commercial, um, because or do something that is not what you should not do, what you should do based on what's happening in the commercial world. Radio, I mean, there was no MTV there, but whatever. I would say to the band, um, if you can, whittle down a song that has potential to get on the radio because radio was changing in the mid to late 70s. But don't change what you do, which we kind of did in something like Giant for a Day, and that was a kind of mistake. But do what I did, in fact, effectively with Dream Theater when they turned in, Images and Words, and they had a song called Pull Me Under, and it was 7 or 8 minutes long. But the chorus was there, so we whittled it down to 4 minutes, and it was there. It was the thing that broke them. I would probably say, look, what one of your songs has the potential to be a song that could get on the radio easily. Just, just let's do something that may work. But I would never say do something that should be on the radio. Do because that's then you're telling a band to be something else and not who they are. And that's you would never I would never do that. And you have to be if a band is not honest to themselves, then they won't be honest to anyone.
Now, in the book, you mention points a lot. Um, and for those who are unaware, how do points work for A&R people in terms of how they benefit them when album projects become a success?
Well, I mean, points and on albums sold and recording and performances. If the albums are big, uh, if you're a high-end uh, A&R guy, if you like, you are able to ask for or negotiate points from the artist, or not from the artist, from the record company. And I was lucky enough to have, a couple of points on a couple of bands, which, made me a decent living, to be honest with you. I mean, I'm not, going to lie about it. It was having a band like Bon Jovi or other bands sell in their millions, was I was able to get some decent checks, to be honest with you, and able to put my kids through private school. I never grew rich from it, but I had a very good living. But and so the points work is that is that when a band when they do a deal, they get usually an advance, and they usually get a points per album. And when the album has recouped, they get X number of points after the recoupment. So that was back in the day. Today is a whole different animal. It's a whole different situation because record companies I don't think demand. I mean, there's lots of 50/50 or profit sharing, et cetera today. But in those days, yeah, the band would get points from the record company. And of course you have to recoup those points. And to recoup them, there's marketing costs, there's shipping costs, there's art costs, there's marketing, the promotion costs. They'll take everything out before you to see anything. So you really have to sell in the hundreds of thousands before you to see anything that's worthwhile in your bank.
And do you still benefit from some of these mega records in the streaming era, points wise?
No comment.
Okay. Um, well, you discuss your experiences with the hip hop world in depth in the book, and you had to engage artists within an A&R context. And then, of course, we had this amazing situation in which myriad hip hop artists also sampled Gentlegiant's music. What's your sense of the artistry involved in both sides of that equation?
I think I think it's really interesting, and I think that the hip hop world that has embraced Gentle Giant is a very, it's both interesting and probably the most progressive for the most part. The underground world, underground hip hop, not this sort of silly hip hop which you see on the charts. Um, they, in certain respects, they have the same kind of attitude as Gentle Giant did. I mean, they move pieces of music around. And their time signatures in in the backing tracks are really unusual. And they, you wonder why would you think that? Why would you do this? But it all comes together in a way that you wouldn't expect. And honestly, I think some of the best progressive music out there is in the hip hop world. And the fact that the hip hop world has embraced, Gentle Giant and used some of our tracks to sync and to put into their tracks is a compliment. I mean, I when we met Questlove, I met him backstage, and I think you know the story, but when I went backstage at NBC and I was bringing Hart to do and Wilson to do a an appearance with the Roots. The engineer at NBC at Jimmy Fallon said, "Are you the same Derek Shulman that was in this group, Gentle Giant?" And I said, "Yeah." It was like a complete surprise. And he said, "Hold on a minute." And literally, the whole the group came out. Root, it was Questlove and the whole band. And Ann Wilson was standing in a corner, and they were saying to me, "We're not worthy," and asking me for my autograph. And it was such a bizarre situation. And, Questlove, Amir said, "I don't know if you know, but you guys have got a ghetto pass." I've never heard that term before. And so we've been sampled by Run the Jewels, by Mad Villain. I mean, Travis Scott opened his last album with Proclamation. And I went to see him a couple of times, and it's just amazing that 30,000 kids were singing along with Proclamation, not knowing that it's, this band called Gentle Giant, that started the show. But it's a real, I'm really happy that the hip hop world has really taken the band on and moved, and said, "Look, this is interesting music. Let's do something with it." I mean, the same thing happened with Run the Jewels. I saw them and Mike and LP. They've got two guys. They did the same thing. "We love your music," and it's what? I mean, how do you even know it? But they do, and I think the same goes for several other progressive bands as well. Crimson's been sampled, as you know, as well as others. But yeah, I think it's a real honor, to be honest.
And has all this sampling yielded significant financial benefits to all of you?
But there's certainly some. I mean, certainly Travis Scott. I mean, that was a huge hit. I mean, Hyena. And in fact, a couple of weeks ago, we were honored in England with BMI as Songwriters of the Year for having the most spins, if you like, on Spotify than anyone else. So we actually carried on over to get the award because I was still here in the middle. And so we were Songwriters of the Year after got how many 50 years of recording the proclamation.
Now, one of the more fascinating parts, a lot of fascinating stuff in your book, but one of the even more fascinating parts was when you found yourself in the middle of the N.W.A. universe dealing with Eazy-E, and it just sort of blew my mind that we have the Gentle Giant guy dealing with these legendary gangster rappers. Give me some more insight into what it was like to be around Eazy-E, who was just, so consequential for that genre.
Well, I inherited. I mean, when I took over Atco, I inherited several artists, and the Ruthless Records was one. And I remember, having meetings with the guy Jerry Heller, who managed N.W.A. and the whole, the whole Compton thing. And I knew Jerry from before because he was a promoter. He promoted some shows of Gentlegiant in on the West Coast. And he'd advise me. And let it be said, by the way, I don't know if anyone sees Straight Outta Compton, or those. Some of it is not true. I'm telling you this absolutely because Jerry was had it not been for Jerry, this thing would not have broken through as well as it did. However, when I had my first meetings with Jerry, he came in and said, "Well, we've got there's a guy called Dre in N.W.A. He's producing albums now, and he brought in his girlfriend, Michelle A. And Dre was sitting in front of me, and they brought in a couple of other guys who were giant, big hulking, guys. And I thought, honestly, I thought this is just an image. This is just like, they're trying to put a show on for me. So I listened to this track or this album by Michelle A, who was at the time Dre's girlfriend, and not knowing really about that world, to be honest with you. I said to Dre, yeah, this tracks are cool. I mean, but the sound of the drums, whatever you've got, I mean, the beats don't really work for me. Could you remix it? Being a rock guy and telling this guy, could you remix it, made zero sense. However, he was very sweet. He said, sure, I'll go back and we'll give it another shot. And he came back to New York, the same crew, by the way. And there's this big guy at the back whose name was Suge Knight, which I didn't know at the time, and played the track, and it didn't sound that much difference. However, Jerry, said to me, "Say yes, it's okay." And I said, "Okay, this sounds better to me." And we put the record out, Michelle A, No More Lies, and it blew up into a gigantic hit. And then I got to know them, and I went out to LA to meet the guys in Compton, and I got into Jerry's car and to go down to the studio. And I had an A&R young lady there, and she kept calling me and saying, these guys, they have guns and everything. And I said, Karen, her name is Karen. I said, no, it's just an image. Don't worry about it. And I got into Jerry's car and put my hand in the glove department or the side department, and sure enough, there was a 38 and a club. And I thought, okay, this is not just an image. So I got my feet wet by having a hit, and then another track, a song or an album by Dre called DOC. But that world again, I didn't want I really didn't want anything to do with it because when I realized it wasn't just an image, this was the real thing. I said, I'd rather not be involved in this.
And going back to contrast, so many hip hop artists have included in between song skits on their albums. And in fact, Gentle Giant was doing that way back on the Interview album in 1976. And I'm wondering, have you ever considered that even that element of Gentle Giant went on to influence hip hop?
That's a good point. I never thought of that. Possibly. I mean, I'll have to ask, Travis or Amir that's very possible because yeah, we did. You're right. We it wasn't just the tracks; it was in between tracks that we put in. In fact, right now I'm remixing in a glass house, which was the only album we didn't have the multis to, and I'm remixing it with the highest end AI. I'm able to separate not just the stems, but the actual instruments, which is amazing actually. And in between the tracks, there's little bits and pieces that I think they're interesting. And I hopefully grab the listener. That's a good. I don't know, but I think this is very possible. Yeah.
So the book also covers the idea of knowing when to walk away. What's your perspective on timing as it related to you wrapping up things with Gentle Giant and then wrapping up your Polygram and Atco eras? When did you know it was the right time to go to the next thing?
When when the job when the situation you're in feels like a job and not something which is creative, not something which is about who you are. When it takes over when it takes over your life and you have to do something because it's how you make a living, that's that's the time to say stop. This is not who I am. And I mean I remember literally at ADCO, for instance, I had a joint venture. But I remember when there was a lot of political stuff going on. And well, there's a story, it probably isn't in the book, I'm not sure. But I remember sitting with my general manager, and I heard something on the radio, and I said, I've heard this track before. What is it? It's a good track. And he looked at me like I was like brain dead. And he said, what are you talking about? It's ours. It's a group called Sweet Sensation. I realized I was losing myself to because I was in all these corporate meetings. I remember sitting around these big oval tables and saying, Band X next year will sell 200,000. Band Y and I didn't know who Band X or Band Y was. And I looked at myself in the mirror and I was wearing a suit, but I didn't recognize myself. And that was the time I said, I've got to stop this because I'm losing myself into a world which is not who I am. Um, and I said, I don't want to do this anymore. My lawyer said, what are you talking about? And that's the same thing as it being, as a creative person, when it feels like a job, you have to stop. You know, just because you're making money, money's not the objective. It really isn't. I never, ever, ever did anything for the money. I did it for the love of music. And that was something that I still, even in my old age, I'll do, I only want to do it if it's creative and for music and not for anything else. If it makes no money, I don't care.
Well, I personally have nothing but admiration for the decision of Gentle Giant to stop when it did. And now here in 2025, we have all of these bands from the 60s and 70s that still roam the earth, combining members now in their 70s and 80s with much younger people who weren't even born when the bands were established. What are your thoughts on these sort of entities at the moment? And do you ever sort of get a shudder thinking, thank goodness Gentle Giant isn't one of them?
Yeah, you read my mind. Um, I, that's one thing that I would have hated had we continued, and become a tribute band to ourselves, and try to get into size, 28 waist when your waist is 10 inches, bigger, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I don't begrudge anyone or any band or any musician making a living playing music, but to try to be someone who you were 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, and play the music that was played, especially when the artist who was on stage was not in the band. It's bizarre to me, and I can only think that had Gentle Giant continued, and that would have happened somehow or other, even though you think it would never happen, but it probably would have happened. It would have been awful. It would have been the worst thing to happen to our band because I think that I'm going to say this: the legacy that we left is still intact, and it's not besmirched by anything that was something which wasn't our own. I really sometimes I've seen several bands that don't have any members in, And they play well. They play the songs really well, but it just I don't know what to make of it. I know the music. I understand that people want to hear those songs, but it just doesn't make sense to me, and it makes me kind of cringe, to be honest with you. I'm sorry. I understand, and I really realize that everyone has to make a living, but for me. It would be the worst, the worst thing. I mean, there's been certain times over many years that people have said, you guys should get together. And in fact, we've had offers over the many years, really big ones, to get together. But, it would have been so wrong to do it. And so we never did it. And I'm glad we never did. And we made the decision to say, when that chapter is closed, it really is closed. It's not, slightly open or you could look peek in again.
Well, speaking of cringe, one thing I was surprised that was missing from your book is the hot mess you were handed with Yes post Big Generator during your initial year at ATCO. Reflect on what was going on.
Oh boy. Well, as you know, I've been involved with Yes from in many many ways, and from playing with them on stage in Gentlegiant, and even before, they were in different bands as we were, and Sin and everyone else. Um, but Yes, we're on the label, and they were the deal was quite high, and they were I get these calls from Chris, from John, um, and to send them money all the time. I mean, literally, could you send $100,000 because my wife wants this, want that, and they were supposed to be in the studio, and I think who was um, I don't know if Trevor was in the band. Yeah, Trevor was in the band then. Trevor had joined the band. Um, and we literally went through $1.5 million without a note being demoed. And I asked Trevor and Chris, so where are we going with this? And they had no answer. And to be perfectly honest, I had to drop the band. I mean, that was a really bizarre situation that it was going nowhere, and they didn't know where they were going. There was cinema, there was Yes, there was and so it was so I believe they're going to deal with Arista when I said, look, I can't continue. We've already spent $1.5 million and nothing has been made, and I think after and they were spending money like it was going out of style and without any notes being made. So it's sad to say, but I had to say we can't do this. I'm gonna, my budget, I'll be out of a gig tomorrow, because you've spent basically your more than your budget for the album and nothing's been done. So they went on to, I'm not sure if it was Yes or AWB at that point. Um, for Arista, I can't remember to be honest with you, but I had to,
ABWH
yeah,
did
AWH.
Arista, and then that morphed into the Yes Union project with ATCO engaging in some machinations, I guess,
There
that,
was,
you know,
there were so many, it's just so many bits and pieces that were all over the place. That it blew, actually, that blew my mind that this band was such a great band when we played with them. Honestly, when we toured with Yes on their Close to the Edge tour, they were superb. Absolutely. They were second to none. But what I inherited at that point was a band that was like completely disoriented and all over the place and had no vision of who they were and where they were going. And it was very sad to see that.
um, I don't mean to belabor this, and I have two or three other more interesting questions for you, but you were there when John Anderson quit, and then they were scrambling for a vocalist with, was it Roger Hodgson and Billy Sherwood were brought into the mix? What do you remember about that crazy phase?
Well, I remember, that I had Chris, uh, they were looking for a singer, and I knew Billy because I'd signed at the end of Polygram World Trade. And Billy became a friend. I mean, there's a story here, which it's probably too long to tell. But as I was leaving the company, I said to Billy, I'm going to make sure that you're taken care of. I loved actually that first album of World Trade. I thought it was a great album. Um, and I got it made, but I knew I was leaving to go to Antco. But the management of the company, the Dick Asher, who's running, thought that I was going to run away with this album to Adco. And so I kind of like stirred the pot a little more so that they would get an incredible deal. And a deal that ordinarily they shouldn't have got. But they were able to get a lot of money. But Billy and the band, I thought were great and nice. Billy, he thanked me for doing what I did to keep him in money, and we stayed in touch. And when Chris and the band were looking for a new singer, I introduced him. I introduced him to Billy Sherwood, and I said Billy is a guy that number one is a really good musician, but also a great singer. They got together and it was almost a marriage made in heaven. They got on so well. And Billy joined the band or joined what was going to be whatever it was. I was it whether it was cinema or yes or I've forgotten the various incarnations of what was, but they were best of friends from that day on.
But that lineup never turned out anything.
I don't think so. No, they didn't. It didn't. But Billy, of course, stayed in touch with Chris, and Billy's the front guy of Yes now.
And was
Um,
Roger Hodgson really in the running for that role as they claimed back then?
no, no, no. I think he's been mentioned, but Roger was always in Supertramp. I mean, he was not going to leave that situation. Whereas, the World Trade were already, I think they'd broken up at that point. Um, but I stayed in touch with Billy, and Billy is a great friend and very talented.
Another curious project you worked on at Atco, which you do touch on in the book, was Pete Townshend's Iron Man, which must have been laden with ultra complexity. Can you expand on some of the issues and bringing that to life beyond the
Well,
book?
well, I didn't. I actually didn't work with Pete actually. Um, no, I inherited two or three artists, as I said, um, at Atco. Um, and the one story. No, I mean he had. I no, I didn't work with Pete actually. I think that was done before I was at the company. But I did work. I did. Join the Warner Music Group, and I inherited two or three bands who were well known. But the story that I think is probably more important is when I heard that Atlantic were going to drop AC/DC. And I couldn't believe what I heard because their last couple of albums just didn't do very well. I mean, a flick of the switch and I can't remember the other one was. And when I heard that they were going to be dropped because their deal was pretty heavy, I said to the head of Atlantic, Doug Morris, how about, I mean, this is bizarre, but how about trading Stevie Nicks, who I inherited, for AC/DC? And the managers of AC/DC were happy that they had someone that they could speak to. So I got AC/DC on Atco. And I was lucky in the fact that George Young, who was initially one of he produced the early albums. When the band heard my name, they asked George. They said, "You know this guy, Derek Shulman?" And they said, "If he's the guy that was in Simon Dupree, the Big Sound, because the Easy Beats played with Simon Dupree, we got along. He's a musician, so you could trust him." So I was able to get their Malcolm and Angus's trust, And they opened the door for me, which is very unusual because they used to shut out all of the record company. They hated record company people. They thought we were all suits and knew nothing else. And they understood that I was not that person. And so I was able to sit down with Malcolm and Angus and say, okay, look, you know, I'm here with you, and let's get an album which is an AC/DC album that you're going to be proud of. And at the same time, I went to my go-to producers in Vancouver, Bruce Fairbairn, Bob Rock, and Mike, I'm blanking, Mikey, and say, look, are you interested in AC/DC? And Bruce said, absolutely, as long as the songs are right. So they got writing some demos, and we sent them off to Bruce and Bob. And they said these are great. So we went up to Vancouver. I was there for at least 4 or 5 times, and we came back with an album called The Razor's Edge. We put Thunderstruck out, and AC/DC was back, and it's like a baseball trade, but suddenly they're back in in the World Series, if you like. And I'm proud of being able to have them back in the swing of things and actually watching the band, record, because I learned a great deal of why AC/DC was different to other rock bands. Um, seeing how that band, their rhythm section wasn't the one that wasn't the band that pushed the rhythm. It was Malcolm. The rhythm section, stayed on the ones. They didn't push the music. It was Malcolm's guitar that pushed the sound of their music. And that's why AC/DC is very different to most other rock and roll bands. The rhythm guitar was the rhythm section. Anyway, so that was my story about inheritance of bands.
So going back to an earlier thread in our conversation, and in the book, you talk about using AI to reconstruct in a glass house for surround, despite the master tapes being lost. And of course, we have the situation in which AI-generated music is swarming streaming services with many listeners seemingly disinterested in the origin of their music. They don't even care that it was AI generated. So talk about the double-edged sword of AI in the modern music industry, in your opinion.
Well, what I'm doing with AI is 180 from what other people or other people are doing, I guess, and putting music out as a band that is non-existent. I'm working with music that was already we recorded and trying to separate the songs, trying to separate the instruments. To use an AI to record to sound like something or be like someone or is very dangerous for both listeners and musicians. Because AI doesn't invent things; it takes things from other people. Again, a musician does things not with technology will help you, but a musician takes things from here, from there, from your gut, and from your soul, and not those four things AI will never ever emulate. So, when you talk about music and musicians, yes, you can have something which sounds interesting and good, but it will never have those things that a human can have. And if I were a band today, and I realize it's so difficult for new bands to break through. But if I was a band today, I would look at the history of what the new pop music started, which was the Beatles. The Beatles, when they happened, they changed everything, in England especially. I would go back to say, okay, I would three mics, a drummer, great songs, great vocals, and no pyro, no bells and whistles, just that, just that, and be a band that just does that, and they would be bigger than ever. That would be if I was at A&R again, I would look for a band that stands there and sings without all the bullshit other with which other bands have and tries to emulate all these great productions and stands there and sings great songs that no one's ever heard before and are something that and puts on a uniform like the Beatles did and they would be huge.
Can you imagine what your experience or life would be like if you were an A&R person in the streaming and AI era?
I wouldn't do it. I couldn't do it. And, no, wrong, wrong. I'd find it very difficult to weed out um, an artist or artists that were authentic, but there are some. There are some, especially in the UK. The UK, for whatever reason, still has um, artists that don't look at views and likes and TikToks and this and that and the other. All that stuff is bullshit to me. That really is. It makes no sense. I really I've sat in record companies now and seen how A&R works, and they look at how many views you've had, how many followers you've got. That means nothing. What means something is, as I said just now, is something which is yours and yours alone. And whether you've got one view or 10 views or zero views, something which is authentic and something which no one else is doing, and something which appeals to every part of your body. And it's very hard for I know it's very hard for artists to find that for a fine audience these days to have that, but that's what I look for.
I'm curious, what are your thoughts about this prevailing trend of giant catalog sales occurring through the realm of classic rock these days?
Well, if it wasn't for these giant catalogs, what you mean these to these financial uh, well, I think it's something that it's going to be bad for those catalogs. Ultimately, they are going to end up as AI generated pieces of music, which which would effectively turn them into things they never were. We've been offered to sell our catalog and everything else. There's not a chance in hell that would do that. They could go down to our kids, our grandchildren, but never ever to a corporation. I'm not doing that. There's no way because ultimately it will to monetize it. These kinds of things. They'll go to these. Yeah, first of all, you'll have these things on commercials, and then AI will be part of that, and the artist has no say in that, and they'll become pieces of music that are generated by these machines, and so it's I understand it's a lot of money for artists that have made their living and they want to get a payout. I understand that, and they I can't deny that that's enticing. But as far as music is concerned, it's bad for music.
All right, well, my very last question for you is what's next for Derek Shulman in the coming months and years?
A little nap is first, and then we're working on well, as you know, the new remix of In a Glass House, and there's a couple of documentaries which are in the works. My son is actually in the work in pre-production um, about the hip hop world embracing the Gentle Giant music, and it's fascinating because it's not just Travis Scott. I mean, there's a whole litany of things, and I think it's really, really interesting. So there's that, and there's another one, a documentary, which talks about in the book, there's a story about the Moscow show we put on um, in Moscow for a peace, not a peace thing, but when the wall came down. And the story behind that is is incredible. I mean, it was to put that show on was difficult enough, but the story behind it in the corruption and the state of Russia and the USSR at that point was beyond belief. I mean, we literally had to fly back on the Concorde to the USA to bring back suitcases full of, $500,000 to give to Yeltsin, to give to the head of the army. And then literally the day before the show, the army said, we don't have enough people, so the show can't go on. Mark Ross, who worked with me, had to fly back to New York to bring back another $250,000 to give to the. I mean, it was the corruption and seeing this country, this so-called big superpower. When I landed in Moscow, it was like a crumbling. It was like the South Bronx in 1970s. It was just such a culture shock. And everyone in America or everyone in the West was scared of this country, which was a crumbling mess. So it's a story about that, and but certainly how we put on the show despite the army and the mayor and the government getting their piece to make sure it happened.
Is there any potential for a large-scale history of Gentlegiant documentary?
I think the hip hop one will incorporate that as well. In fact, it will do, in fact.
So is
So
is the hip hop thing an element of a larger story, or is hip hop the focus?
hip hop is the gateway into the where and what Gentle Giant is about and how it came to pass and how hip hop, in certain respects, brought it to a bigger audience and but so we start with that and then we go back to where we were, with a band from Dupree and all the other and there's a ton of footage as well, which is one thing that we had for some reason is a lot of TV from Gentle Giant and it's quite interesting.
Well, thank you so much for your time. It's wonderful to see the legacy of this music continue so forcefully through the ages. It's amazing that we're at 2025, 40 years after I first heard Gentle Giant, and it's still a thing. That's a real testament to the music and to your vision. And I thank you for your time.
Well, thanks, everyone. And it's yeah, for me as well. It's just I'm just really proud that after, as you said, 40 years that because it's not just this forgotten little thing back in it's still I guess it's still vibrant and vital, and I'm just really happy that that's the case.